All right, thank you so much. My name is Jasper Dent. I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers in Saskatoon. This event is coming to you from Treaty 6 territory. This is the land of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota, and homeland of the Métis Nation. It's my pleasure to welcome you tonight to the Saskatoon launch of A Communist for the RCMP, the uncovered story of a social movement informant by Dennis Grending, published by Between the Lines. Thank you to Dennis for being here tonight and for working with us to create the event. And thank you to Between the Lines for publishing this book so that we can have this event. Before we begin, please note that this event is being live streamed. The web camera is just up to your right here. It'll be focused on Dennis and on the stage area. We won't be recording the audience. However, it will pick up if your phone rings in the middle of the event. So now is a great time to silence or turn off the devices. Also related to that, during the Q&A portion, I have a microphone that I'll bring around to the audience for anyone wishing to ask a question. I know not everyone likes using microphones, but we do ask that you please do make use of it so that anyone watching online can hear what is being said, the question that's being asked, and therefore understand the answer. And also, just in case anyone in the audience is hard of hearing, this room tends to swallow sound with all of the books, so we really appreciate you keeping that in mind. Dennis will be sticking around afterwards to sign books. We have copies of A Communist for the RCMP up here at the signing table, and also back on the desk by where you came in. So finally, I would like to introduce our author for the evening. Dennis Grending was born and raised in rural Saskatchewan. He attended university here in Saskatoon and worked as a newspaper reporter for the Prince Albert Herald, the Saskatoon Star Phoenix, and the Windsor Star. He later worked for the CBC out of Regina, including 4 years as co-host of CBC's radio morning show. Dennis has written or edited 8 previous books, including biographies of former Saskatchewan Premier Alan Blakeney and of Emmett Hall, whose Royal Commission recommended Medicare for Canada. He served as an NDP MP in the 36th Parliament in the late 1990s. And Dennis currently lives with his wife Martha in Ottawa and came all this way to talk to us tonight. So everyone, please give him a very warm welcome.
Thank you, Jasper. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's really great to see so many friendly faces, many of them familiar and some not familiar, but still friendly. I want to thank McNally Robinson for one thing. Bookstores like this are precious, and this is really a wonderful bookstore. Am I not loud enough, Martha? Okay. And Jasper, I want to thank you because we were back and forth quite a lot, and I found you very good to work with, so thank you. And I'll put in just a little plug for Turning the Tide Books as well, another very important cultural institution in Saskatoon. I'm going to have a little bit of trouble with my throat tonight because it's thick, so please bear with me. I may end up having some water a few times. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about the book itself, A Communist for the RCMP. It's the story of a long-time informant for the RCMP, first in Calgary and then in Regina. His name was Frank Hadesbeck. He came to Canada in 1906 as an infant with his family who were from Hungary. They were German people who had been sent down there by the Habsburgs to form a bulwark against the Ottomans hundreds of years previously. And by the early 1900s, they were out of land and looking for places to go, and many of them came to Canada. Frank Hadesbeck's family didn't have it very easy once they got here. The parents both died within a few years. He was orphaned at age 11. He got kicked around a lot. Got taken to the United States by some brothers who moved there. So he kicked around in the United States from 1919 till 1929. He came back to Canada just in time for the Great Depression. He was an itinerant farm worker, and he ended up mostly in Taber and Lethbridge, Alberta. Things were so drastic for him that he thought he would be better off fighting in the Spanish Civil War than he was in Canada during the Depression, which I think was naive, but that's what he did. He spent 8 months there. When he came back, he went back to the Lethbridge area, and it was there that he was recruited by the RCMP to be an informant. And the deal was he had to be able to join the Communist Party in Calgary. He was able to do that quite easily because of his bona fides arising out of the Spanish Civil War, where he went without any great political or ideological commitment, but mostly because he thought he'd be better off. He infiltrated the Communist Party in Calgary from 1941 to 1946. In 1946, he and his wife moved back to Regina, and he tried to quit the racket, but his business ventures failed, and in 1952, he was re-recruited. And between 1952 and 1976, he informed on not only the Communist Party, that was the main object of surveillance, but also on any manner of progressives in Alberta and later in Saskatchewan. And we'll talk more about who some of those people might have been. He was unceremoniously dumped by the RCMP in 1976. They didn't need him anymore, so they gave him 15 $100 bills and had him sign something and told him to leave and leave them alone. He lived until 2006, so he lived to be 100. He was at Pioneer Village in Regina. So for a long period of time after his service, if you will, with the RCMP, he lived in a retirement residence. It was at some point in 1987 when he met Otto Dreger, who was going to be here tonight from Regina, but can't be. But Otto was a professor, actually he was the dean of social work at the University of Regina, and he came into contact with Frank Hadesbeck. And Frank Hadesbeck had been trying to write his life story by hand, many versions of it, but they were pretty well all the same and not getting anywhere. So he thought Otto could write his life story. Otto was interested and took away a lot of his papers and photocopied them and then gave him the originals back. But eventually decided not to write the book, either because he maybe didn't have time, or he also mentioned he was warned off of it by the RCMP officer who was in charge of the depot in Regina. So a long time later, in 2019, Otto called me and told me he had these papers and he didn't want them anymore, but he didn't want to throw them away. And he asked me if I would like to have them. So I picked them up, a banker's box full of papers. And it took me a while because I was doing some other things, but it took me a while to get to them. And it took me a while to decide there was a story here. But some people wiser than me in this field of surveillance and policing thought it was a worthwhile thing to do. And I agreed and started working on the book. It took me quite a while. So that's kind of the story of Frank Hadesbeck and where the book started. I want just to mention what my intention was, and maybe I can do that by just reading very briefly from someone who wrote a blurb for the book. It's someone his name is Jim Machorek, and he's a professor at the University of North Dakota. I've not met him, but publishers often get people to do a blurb for your book, and he did one for the book. And I thought the way he described it was my intent to begin with. He says, this biography of longtime RCMP informant Frank Hadesbeck is groundbreaking. Although we already know much about the force's use of informants and spies, never before have we seen their work from the ground up. Here we have a mole's eye view provided through the notes Hadesbeck secretly took and kept against his handler's explicit orders from 1941 to the mid-1970s. We also get to see how the Mounties cast their net for, quote, dangerous individuals and movements well beyond the Communist Party. Virtually every social movement participant who dared question the status quo was treated as a potential enemy of the state, including those who advocated for Medicare. And they ended up on the force's watch-out list. This book is an eye-opening exploration of just how casually our security services violate our privacy and civil liberties. So yeah, that's what I was trying to do, and that's what this person saw in the book. Frank Hadesbeck was really a foot soldier. He was not a high-profile person. He was not highly important. He wasn't a Kim Philby who could give away state secrets. But he was one of hundreds, perhaps thousands of people like him spread across the country who would come up with any little tidbit of information that they were asked to look for, or maybe even weren't asked to look for, and supply it back to the RCMP. In fact, the McDonald Commission, which looked into RCMP wrongdoing, reporting in, I think, in the early 1980s perhaps, found that between 1919 and 1979, the RCMP had opened files on 800,000 Canadian individuals or organizations. If you think of how much space that would take in a vault when you have it in paper, you get the idea. It's massive. And they have to have a lot of people around the country who are providing that kind of information. Some of them were unpaid informants who would do it. Others were like Hadesbeck who were paid. And still others were RCMP security officers who would do stakeouts and infiltrations. We might want to ask why the RCMP surveilled so broadly. And the answer is that the state, the people who gave them their marching orders, and the force itself had an abiding fear of communism, which arose from the Russian Revolution, the Winnipeg General Strike in 1919, the formation of the Communist Party in 1921, labor radicalism in the 20s, especially in the 30s, and then the formation of other social movements and political movements like the CCF or the Social Credit or even the Union Nationale in Quebec. These were responses to the failure of the system. And the way the RCMP always looked at this is as these individuals causing trouble, rather than looking at the system in a way that acknowledged it was failing people. So I think that's behind everything in this book. It's behind all the marching orders that he got over all the years. The irony of this is that by the 1950s, let's say, the Communist Party was really irrelevant in terms of the political dialogue in Canada, or maybe not the dialogue, but certainly any political power. But the RCMP kept that surveillance going right up until the wall came down, and I think it was a major reason for being for them and for the budgets and for their own self-interest, I guess. But that's behind everything that they did. I'd just like to talk a little bit about how I researched the book. What Otto gave me was the mother lode. It was a banker's box full of papers. Hadesbeck had been warned by his handlers not to keep notes, but he did. And what they would do is give him names to go looking for and ask at Communist Party gatherings and ask about person X, Y, and Z, and we'll get to some of them in a minute. And they would give him photographs. And then they would debrief him, usually in hotel rooms in Regina, about what he had learned about these individuals. They would then take notes, or they would sometimes tape the meetings they had with him. And then every time they had a meeting with him, an RCMP Security Service officer would write a report. And the report would be kept in Ottawa, always by his descriptor was a number, 810 in his case, rather than his name, so that it couldn't be traced even by other members of the RCMP who did not know about it. So I used those notes, but it occurred to me that I have to write about him, and I like writing about people, but I have to write about him because why did he do it, and how did he get away with it, and was he good at it? He probably was, because he did it for so long. So I did a lot of research about him and his family, using Ancestry, using the census, using the Library and Archives Canada, and the American Archives, because he had enrolled in the American Army and quickly deserted. But that came in handy, that brief experience came in handy when he was in Spain. So I did a lot of research about him, and then about the people who were persons of interest, or as he called it, people in his watch-out list. So if there was someone in his watch-out list, I would think, okay, let's broaden this out. It's on his watch-out list, but what does that mean? Did the RCMP actually follow these people? So let's say Roy Atkinson, the National Farmers Union. There's little snippets that Hadesbeck talked about Roy Atkinson. So I wondered, is there a file on Roy Atkinson, the Farmers Union? There are a lot of access to information requests that are made in Canada. It's a terrible system. It takes years and years to get anything, which I found out in doing this book. But once a request is made and information is released, it is then available in the reading room at Library and Archives Canada. At least a long finding aid is available. And you can go and ask for, let's say, the file in the National Farmers Union, which I did. And of course, Roy Atkinson's name did pop up. Another one was Dr. Howard Adams, who was a Métis activist and an academic here at the University of Saskatchewan. Hadesbeck had something to say about him. Never much. You wouldn't want to rely on what he had to say to create a file on these people, but that was just part of what was happening. He was asked, but they had their other people doing surveillance. So yes, there's a lot on him. The RCMP were very interested in him. So that would be another thing I did with the RCMP handlers. He wrote down who they were, when he met them, what their addresses were in Regina, what their phone numbers were, what their wife's name was if he socialized with them. So I went back through the Henderson's directory for the city and saw if those people were in it. Were they in the RCMP? In some cases, they even said they were in the security service. There's another very good resource called RCMP Graves, where former RCMP officers created a big list of anybody who ever served in the Northwest Mounted, Royal Northwest Mounted, or RCMP, when they were born, when they joined, where they served, when they last served, and if they died, when they died. So I was able to cross-reference many of the names, all the names that Hadesbeck had against the RCMP Graves list. And so I can say with assurance that all these people were in the place he said they were at the time he said they were there. Okay, I think I'm going to leave it at that. There were a couple of other little things, but I don't want to take too much time. We're going to be talking to some very interesting people as well this evening, so I want to be sure we get to that. But I just thought I'd give you a little sense of some of the things that I have written. This chapter is called "Casting a Wide Net," which means he cast a lot wider net than the Communist Party. Frank Hadesbeck's note during the 1970s contained dozens of brief entries describing meetings with a succession of RCMP handlers, usually in Regina hotel rooms. The Communist Party and its affiliated organizations remained his focus, even though the party had faded into near irrelevance by then. The surveillance, however, went well beyond that. Hadesbeck had lists containing labor leaders, university professors and students, Indigenous leaders, some members of the clergy, and certain religious organizations, progressive farm organizations, especially the Farmers Union. The RCMP also continued to be suspicious of the peace movement and of groups devoted to protecting human rights. And I go on to say that as a journalist in Saskatchewan in the 70s, so there's a little bit of overlap between when I was being a journalist here and when Hadesbeck was ending pretty well at the end of his career. And so many of the names that he has on his watch out list are people I'm familiar with, just as many of us would be. But I certainly was as a journalist who worked in this province for a number of years. What I did is I said I've organized a sampling of these individuals and groups to simplify the diffuse handwritten notes that Hadesbeck created and preserved. So there was the Communist Party, of course, and there's a lot on that. And one person, I had a hard time finding anybody who'd been in the Communist Party at that time. Most of these people aren't alive anymore, but there were a couple, and one is a man named Ed Lehman, who some of you may know. He lives in Regina and was just graduated from university, I think, about the time that he was in the party. And when I informed him that his former comrade had been an RCMP informant, he was astonished. Ed said, "I'm quite blown away by the information you provided to me. At first, I felt like writing and saying it can't be true," because he said Frank was a very unobtrusive individual. He only had grade 3 education. He wasn't on the surface a really impressive individual, although he was a very natively intelligent person, I have found. So Ed was very surprised that the guy he'd confided in and spent so much time with had been actually betraying him. Farm organizations, I've told you about the National Farmers Union. So Hadesbeck had a little bit of stuff about Roy Atkinson, but when I looked in the archives, I found that they had people at the RCMP had people at the founding convention in 1969, and they had a report on what Atkinson had to say. And if I can find this, it just gives you a little indication of how they did things. And I can't find it, so I'll leave it. The page is mostly blacked out, but you know who they're talking about if you were following this at all. To my surprise, this is still related to the farm movement. I also found the name of Father Philip Lair on Hadesbeck's watchout lists. Lair was a Benedictine monk at St. Peter's Abbey near Humboldt, Saskatchewan. And the monks had a boarding school for boys, which I attended in the 1960s. Lair was a diminutive man, ever smiling and always gracious, but he had an analysis of the farm situation that was close to that of the NFU. He was a convener of agriculture and rural life for his Catholic diocese, acting as a resource for meeting and discussion groups within the church. He was also in demand for NFU events, and he collaborated in research with the sociology department at the University of Regina. And in 1972, he was part of a farm delegation to China organized by the NFU. I was surprised to see Father Philip's name in there, to say the least. And one of my other former teachers at the college's name was on there as well. The RCMP also spied on the NDP, and we're especially concerned about the Waffle. Now, the Waffle, as I think most or everyone in this room knows, was on the left of the NDP, sort of came to bear in the late 60s into the 70s. And the RCMP was terribly concerned that the Waffle was somehow going to, the Waffle would be infiltrated by communists, and the Waffle and the communists would infiltrate the NDP. And the Blakeney government got elected in 1971, was quite an activist government, and for example, set up the Northern Department of Northern Saskatchewan, set up the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission, and the RCMP were very concerned about that. And actually, I have from the archives a couple of reports where they actually did a kind of a flow chart of government departments talking about people of interest who were working, of interest to them, who were working for the government, including you, I think, Denise, at that time. And they were particularly concerned about Walter Smishuk, who they were convinced was a communist. And he was the Minister of Health at that time. And his parliamentary secretary was John Richards, who ran ran on behalf of the Waffle, I believe, in 1971. So I could give you more examples, but I think I'm going to be getting long. The last thing I want to mention, because someone said to me not long ago, yeah, okay, so you have all this information here about what Frank Hadesbeck said, but so what? Like, what does it matter? Did someone die? Or did someone, get hurt in some terrible way? And I'd have to say no. Nobody that I know of died because of Frank Hadesbeck. But why would there be 800,000 files on people if they weren't going to be used? Would be one thing. Another thing is, if you look back historically, all the way back to the RCMP picking up kids from residential schools, go to World War I when thousands of most aliens were picked up, or in the 40s after the Communist Party was against our participation in World War II. A lot of them, including William Beeching and people like that, who was a communist in Saskatchewan, were interned. The point is that they knew where to find people. Their analysis of the situations was laughable in many cases when you read what they wrote about meetings. But on the other hand, they knew where they could find you in the middle of the night and pick you up and incarcerate you. And really, that was their job. It wasn't so much analysis as it was that. So when people say, does it matter? Yes, it matters. And if I can be very specific, Stan Rands, who was someone in Saskatchewan and taught at the university and was very involved in organizing the community clinic movement, he was fired from the National Film Board because they acknowledged he was not a communist, but they said people are saying you're a communist, and so we have to get rid of you. He came to Saskatchewan to work for the Douglas government, and the RCMP came to his employer and tried to have him fired. They wouldn't fire him. Sally Mahood, who's a doctor whose mother was the first doctor to work for the community clinic here, has told me that her father was denied a job with UNESCO because of his quote communist connections. So it does make a difference, is the point I'm making. And the massive difference that it made, which I don't report on because Hadesbeck never talked about it, is the hunt for gay people in the civil service after the Guzanko affair came up in 1946 and the Cold War got going in Rio. A lot of people lost their jobs and a lot of people were forced out. So I guess my point is it does matter, and there was a rationale to it. At that point, I think I'll leave it because I would like to invite two people who had some experience with surveillance at the time, and we're going to have a little chat. So if you'll move the chairs around a bit, we'll start with that. This, by the way, is the NFU convention that was surveilled. When you get things, this is what it usually looks like. You don't get very much information.
Is it okay if I take the children to
So I would like to introduce people who probably don't need an introduction, people in this room, but then one never knows. Dennis Curry and Dawn Cossack. Denise and Dawn have been activists in Saskatchewan for many years. I've known both of them since student days, and they've agreed to come and respond or talk to some of the things that have come up in the book. And I was in touch with them and did interviews with them, and they're both mentioned in the book, so you'll want to see the names. But I'm going to start with the student radicalism and the surveillance of student radicalism. Dawn's name does come up in Frank Hadesbeck's notes, but in a very cursory way. But we do know from other research that has been done, including a book called Spying 101 by a guy named Stephen Hewitt, who attended the University of Saskatchewan and wrote the book about the surveillance of students and student movements. So I'd like to start by asking both Dawn and Denise a little bit about their experience in the student movement. I guess I'm wondering if you had any idea that you might be under surveillance would be a place to start.
Well, yeah, hello everybody. As I was listening to you, and I've read some of your book, I think it's really good. It's really instructive. Campus. So when we got to the Soviet Union, we weren't about to buy the line of the Soviet Union. So we ended up making, lots of friendships and finding out and meeting these students who were from Czechoslovakia and all that. But at that time, when people were trying to take the power away from the government. But when I came back, I was called by the RCMP. And for a week, they called me each day and they say, we want to talk to you. I said, I'll talk to you as long as we can bring somebody else from the newspaper in Carolina. No, we want to talk to you. So on the final day, they said, well, you're not talking to us and you better watch out because we may let loose something about you that you wouldn't like. And I was 20 years old and I thought, well, go ahead. But anyways, those are very important parts that I think of. And another part that happened was that as much as it was, there were different lines. I mean, the RCMP had its line of finding out. But one of the things that happened to us, there was a person who was being around us when we were producing the newspaper. And this person finally admitted that he was part of what used to be the Reserve Officer Training Plan or something like that. Anyways, he was asked to tell them what was going on with us. So he wasn't directly with the RCMP, but he was feeding information back through his military links. So in a way, it always grabbed me that, we were people trying to make change and we believed in that. But as you were saying, 800,000 people over, that many years have been surveilled. And it is a really attack on human rights in that area. So that's why I just wanted to touch more on that. People were active, they were good, but we lost people too at the same time. And that's not right. It takes away citizenship from people and action.
Denise, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about your student experience and whether you ever encountered anything that made you suspect.
Well, yeah, that's the funny thing. When you brought us up here, you said our experience with surveillance. And I never had any conscious experience of surveillance. Obviously, I did because you raised it in your book and you interviewed us, but I had no knowledge of it. And in the student movement and the student days. I was active in the peace movement. I was active in the anti-apartheid movement, women's movement, various things. But, you know, I must have been, maybe my eyes were shut. I'm not sure. I was busy doing what I was doing, thinking things through, trying to make change. And I never had any interactions with, that I knew of, with RCMP or surveillance. So it's interesting. Yeah.
Well, we'll get back to you a little later where your name does pop up.
I wanted to add one more thing that happened. When we were, it's at the Regina campus as well. And it's with one of the professions, by the way, who was named. So when we found out that this person, you know, was reporting back to the military, we had to make a decision. And the decision was, do we go public? We were on the verge of doing a story on this person. So we had to have a discussion about whether we should do that. And we felt that, you know, that was too much for that person to have to handle. He obviously had something wrong with him, and he didn't do that. But there was an interesting debate over whether you expose people as well, you know, and what they're doing. And so we had to work that one through. Well, do you expose them, or do you tell them you don't want them to do that anymore? And we felt at that time that that was too heavy to do in terms of saying this person's public and this is what he was doing.
Okay, I'm going to move on now to the National Farmers Union because Don at some point became an organizer for the National Farmers Union, and his name did not pop up in that context with Frank Hadesbeck, but certainly when I was doing other research, especially in Warren Brown's book and Carolyn Brown's book, The Unauthorized History of the RCMP, they talked about some of the experiences you had as a farm union organizer, and I just wonder if you'd like to share a couple of those.
Yeah, I'm going to give a context for it. A lot of people know about the National Farmers Union, but at that time, the National Farmers Union was extremely militant. We had tractor demonstrations all over. Roy Atkinson got arrested because somebody he claimed he was blocking people from coming over the bridge onto Prince Edward Island. There's things like that that were happening. But what we felt was that, you know, same kind of thing. We know that somebody in our office, the national office, was actually passing information out. And so, and we decided we're not going to get into a huge fight about it. We know who that is. And we weren't going to get into some kind of thing that would take our energies away. But the other thing that happened in all of that was that we were getting people who wanted to get us to over-agitate. We had this person show up with one of our, we were all young organizers, right? We had all this energy. We would meet. And this person said, why don't we take out an elevator? and they wanted to show that, to show the power of, you know, corporate Canada and the grains. But we were so interesting because we decided to read a whole bunch of things about, is this correct that we go and do that? And we said we don't want to do that. We had to think that one through. What happened to that person was he ended up getting very, very sick and he had to leave. But I think it's good to always kind of look at those kind of incidences because it helps you on how you handle that kind of change. The other thing I want to say about the Farmers Union is that, you know, it was an organization that had such an amount of energy driving it that it wasn't going to stop for anything anyways. And that's where I think you believe in yourself. That regardless of who may be going after you or what kind of problems you have when the police show up, and the police showed up a lot, you know, they used to pull me over in my car and check out the back to see what I was carrying around. The point I think is to within yourselves feel good about trying to make social change and not to be intimidated about it. And I thought the Farmers Union really understood that quite well and kept the group together to act on behalf of the people in rural Saskatchewan and links with urban areas.
And I'm going to move to a third aspect, which is the Waffle, which I didn't get into too much detail about. But one of the things that came up in the research is a report done by the Regina detachment in September of 1974. And the background here is that the Waffle was trying to decide whether to stay within the NDP or become a movement of its own. And there was a meeting at Camp Rainer on Lake Diefenbaker in August of 1971. And this is a report about it. And there is a second report which deals with more of the content of those meetings. But this one I found interesting because you'll see there's a list of people named here. And you'll see in the middle that there's a blackout. And what the document says is Following are the corresponding file numbers and a brief rundown of previous involvement of persons mentioned in the attachment, and the file numbers are blacked out. And so what that says to me is that there was a file, or there were files, not necessarily on each individual, but there would have been a file maybe on the Waffle, and they would have been under that umbrella. But I'll just quickly mention a few of the people. Don Mitchell is mentioned, and he was the president of Waffle. Don ran against Alan Blakeney for the NDP leadership in 1970 on behalf of the Waffle, and Roy Roman was in that contest as well. Lauren Brown, a professor at the University of Regina. John Richards, these are all people at the meeting, by the way, and who were listed by the RCMP. MLA, Denise Curry. Denise, you're called an ex-campus radical, member of New Left pressure groups, and a provincial government employee. There are other names that I'll get to Don here. I just have to use my one hand. Oh, by the way, Don Mitchell's wife, Martha Tracy, was there, and she was listed as wife of Don Mitchell, women's liber. And Don Cossack is mentioned as National Farmers Union radical. So the meeting was surveilled. I have no idea who did it, and maybe the people there didn't either, but I would like to ask each of you if you have any recall of that meeting or that event, and if not, if you can just tell us a bit about the context of the time in which surveillance might have occurred.
Well, I mean, I do remember the meeting really well. It was a very interesting meeting. I mean, you talked about how there was a decision about whether or not to leave the NDP. But there was also just a lot of strategy discussions about, society, labor activism, the women's movement, how we should handle things, and so on. So it was a very interesting, thoughtful meeting, really. And there were small group discussions and so on. And I know that one of the documents you pointed out to me was a report that I had written from one of my small groups, which was on the difference between urban-rural organizing and so on. And actually, when I read it, what you showed to me, I just thought, how could this possibly be interesting? Right? So, pragmatic and so on. But anyway, it was, but the whole meeting itself was actually very interesting. Now, to the question of surveillance, like I said before, obviously it was. Who it could be, I don't know. I can't recall all the people in detail. Is there anyone there that I don't know exactly who they were? But yes, it's all very interesting that was all being done. And I just wanted to respond to one of the things about effect, right? Because we don't know the effect. Like, I can't say that I know that I was affected, but maybe I was. Maybe I didn't get that promotion that I asked for. How do I know that there wasn't something that behind the scenes that is related to this, right? It's kind of insidious that way.
I'm going to get to Don in a minute. One of the interesting things when you look at this list of people whose names pop up, and you get people like Don, who was being surveilled, but he's a member of the Order of Canada now. And Denise is a well-respected researcher and organizer, and they've done international work. And you can go down the list. Roy Atkinson, a member of the Order of Canada as well. So the people who were suspect at a certain time end up being recognized for their contributions years later. But Don, I want to get back to you about this meeting in August of 1974 and get your response and your recall, if any.
Is anybody here at that meeting? Anybody else that was there? Well, the meeting was incredible. Like Denise was saying, like there were small groups. You were talking about the economy. You were talking about urbanization. You were talking about education. And I thought it had a lot of creativity in it. But the one thing for me in all of that was that by that time, I think people were fine about doing social change. And we're not going to be intimidated. And so what was put together was really good. People knew that it was going to be always a political struggle. We did end up with things like Sask Water and Sask Oil, people here, you all know about it. But the point was not to stop, but to go ahead and keep going. And I thought there was an energy in that conference. And I used to say to myself, I wish we could have another one. It was good, important.
I think we'll go to some questions or comments from you now, if you have them, and I'll certainly invite Don and Denise to stay up here with me, and they may wish to respond to things you raise as well. But I'd be happy to have you ask questions if you have any, and Jasper will come to you with the microphone if you do.
Let's just raise your hand and I will come find you.
The FBI in the United States notoriously did the same sort of thing, starting probably around the same time. I'm wondering, are you aware, did the FBI activities inspire the RCMP, or vice versa, or was there cooperation between them?
Hi, Dave. I honestly can't answer that with any intelligent response. I'm assuming there was, and there is research I would still like to do that I haven't done about that, particularly when it relates to Medicare. I'm wondering what because the American Medical Association did not like it, and I'm wondering if there was, but I don't know. I don't know if Don or Denise have any specific recall or anything to say about that, but I'm sorry, it's just something I don't know about. I should say, though, that the title of the book came from a series in the United States called A Communist for the FBI, which was a radio program, which later became a television program. And it was very Cold War, commie hunting kind of program. So I was nervous about using the title, but I couldn't pass it up.
I just want to say something a little bit different than the FBI, but one of the things about that period was international solidarity. And so people didn't feel like they were just in Regina or wherever in Saskatchewan. We were working together across the country, and we were working together with people who were trying to fight to stop the Vietnam War. So there was a kind of a ceiling over everything that made people feel we can keep going, we can make these changes. And I think that's the kind of stuff that really helps you deal with the state when they start coming at you. You've got to have that ground. And I think that ground was built very strongly at that time.
Thank you. Anything else?
Thank you very much. I wanted to pick up on that question as well, and I wonder if you found that Saskatchewan was a particular hotspot for this kind of surveillance, relative to other places in Canada, certainly given the political activity here, but also the fact that this was a bit of an ideological magnet for other people coming to the province who were drawn to the left leanings, at least as they were described in the press. So was there something unique about Saskatchewan in terms of the surveillance here?
There may well have been, but again, it's not something that I researched because I was very focused on this. But I think I would say this was a book written by two historians on behalf of the RCMP, which was very difficult to get a hold of. But when they talked about people being placed to do surveillance, they said it was uniformly even across the country. So we had them here and you had them everywhere would be the response to that. Whether Saskatchewan had more, I don't know. Places like Lethbridge, which we now in Alberta, Calgary, we look at as really right-wing places. There's a lot of labor history in those places. And there was a lot of agitation in the coal mines, in the meatpacking plants, and railroad building. So there was surveillance in all these places, I'm sure, but I don't know the answer to that, Erica, in any detail.
And in women's health, by the way, shout out to Denise.
Okay.
The Ku Klux Klan were very strong in Saskatchewan in the 1920s. Is there any, especially around Rosetown and Moose Jaw, they had 30,000 paid up members. Is there any relationship to the Ku Klux Klan and RCMP surveillance?
Well, for one thing, where I started looking was about 1941, because this is when Frank Hadesbeck got recruited. So I didn't do the research on the things you're talking about, Jake. But I think one thing which I can say is between 1919 and about 1949, the RCMP created what they call security reports, bulletins. And they put them out once a week, and they talked about what were all the never-do-well left people doing in all the different places. And some academics, using access to information, got all of these and put them into volumes, so you can read them. And I've read a lot of them. And I can tell you that no matter what was going on, let's say in the 1930s, when fascism was the thing that everybody had to be concerned about, they continued to look at communists and leftists and progressives. And there's very, very little in any of those security reports that deals with the people sympathetic to Nazism, let's say, very little. And there's some documentation from leaders in the RCMP. It's in the book, you'll find it, where one officer says that communism is much more dangerous than fascism because fascism doesn't replace the economic levers of the state. So I think if that was a common opinion of the RCMP leadership, I don't know, but I do know that no matter what else was going on, they were looking at left-wing people rather than right-wing and fascist people.
Briefly, I was checking my grandfather out, Joe Cossack, who was an engineer on Moose Jaw. And so when I was looking at it, I found him on a RCMP list of the 20s. And his number is 1443. But I felt the same way. You know, they're going after Joe Cossack, who was a Ukrainian immigrant who helped build, Hull and Moose Jaw, education, dancing, and so on. He did believe in social change, but he gets nailed. And I really wonder about how many people in the Ku Klux Klan ever got checked out.
Thank you.
Yeah, I only came to Saskatchewan in 1994. Helped on your election campaign.
Thank you.
But my experience is might be somewhat interesting. I discussed it with Greg Keeley at the 1919 to 2019 conference, and he thought I should really go after the files. I was sent to Ottawa by the League for Socialist Action and Young Socialists to be executive director, secretary of the Vietnam Mobilization Committee in 1969. And the only after doing too much union work at the CP Express, getting kicked out of there, the only job I could get was a federal government one. I scored very well on the exam, so they wanted to send me to security and intelligence. And I thought, that will be very dangerous. So I, passed that up after an afternoon. So I can tell you that they had direct teletype, direct with the CIA. And, the reports would come back and forth. And I believe that may also have involved and anyway, I ended up going to Protocol Division, but that was a very bad time for a radical to be sent to the Protocol Division because, and it was 1970 that I was there, because Cross was kidnapped. And all these red files, I was just a filing clerk, all these red files came across my desk. And the thing I noticed, I couldn't help quickly looking at them. I hope I still can't be prosecuted for that. I tried to avoid signing the Official Secrets Act or whatever it is. The amount of information they have is amazing. I'd say in some organizations, I remember CPCML, Canadian Communist Party of Canada, Marxist-Leninist, the Maoist organization, always quite active. They knew the number of members. They knew that these people would fly across, financed largely by sales of the Red Book and so on. They knew everything about many organizations. I could only look quickly. Then the War Measures Act was declared, and unfortunately, I was the person that organized the march on Parliament Hill. It was some other organizations. The phone started clicking and everything else. And Monday morning, I was sent to an office. The nameplate was gone and told that my job was gone. Well, through the help of an NDP MP, I managed to get demoted to a mailroom before I started university. A couple of years later, I worked for Canada. There used to be a student organization for Canada Manpower. And halfway through the summer, the supervisor told me, "You're really doing well here, but you better start looking for another job. I've managed to fight for you to stay till the end of the year." But there was an RCMP file. I could go to many other things, but the thing that is most disturbing about these organizations, they call themselves intelligence organizations, information services. They're anything but. They're very political organizations with a very political agenda. The film, I hope many people have seen it, and I wish it had stayed longer. Manufacturing the threat, about the effort the RCMP made involving 252, or it may have been 262 RCMP staff to entrap two people and get them involved in a conspiracy. And then and I don't know whether but they were in jail for a couple of years, and the judge threw it out as soon as she saw the case, because these people have been entrapped. So I'm just saying, I'll just end by saying we now see another case of the massive terrorist threat, maybe using weapons of mass destruction. This is a father and son in Toronto, and they found a machete and an axe.
Thank you. We'll have, I think I was told by the store that they'd like us to not go longer than an hour, so we maybe have another 7 or 8 minutes left of questions. If
Yeah, we can put a few more in here. I see it up here.
Thanks for that great discussion. I haven't read the book yet, but if I wasn't already looking forward to it, I really am now. And this is probably in there, but I'm wondering if you ever came across parts of Frank Hadesbeck's notes where there was any semblance of a personal opinion about his work and what he was surveilling, or if he was just super pragmatic about it, never really had any opinions in his notes.
he did it for a combination of reasons. I would say mainly the money. He'd been a very poor guy, been kicked around as a youth at grade 3 in school, dyslexia. So he was very concerned about security. He didn't make a lot of money. He probably made about, the way I figured it out from things I'd read, maybe $1,400 a month in today's currency. Not a lot. Also, I think excitement. He was an itinerant farm worker, so he spent a lot of times on farms in Idaho or Alberta shearing sheep or picking sugar beets or whatever. And I think this was a lot more exciting than that life. So those, I think, would be some of his rationales. He also had a bit of a chip on his shoulder about the Communist Party as a result of his service in Spain. He didn't like the fact that there were commissars in the fighting units who sort of were co-leaders along with the military leader. He wrote quite a bit about that. But I think the other thing I would say, though, is that he, at certain times, especially, well, he was rewriting all this as an old man, but he felt used and he felt bitter. He felt that he'd been promised a pension, that he'd given all these years to them, and they called him to a hotel room in September 1976. There were 4 of them, and they had him sign a piece of paper. It would have been the Official Secrets Act, probably, that he wouldn't talk about this. And they gave him 15 $100 bills, and they told him to get lost. And so he felt he had a score to settle with them, and that would be not so much of why he was doing surveillance, but why he wanted to write a book about it. He wanted to get even. But he did have a glimmer every now and then about what he was doing, but by and large, he was kind of cynical about that, I think.
Dennis, in your last chapter, you talked about kind of the role of the RCMP today, especially with respect to Indigenous movements and climate activism. Could you speak a bit about that?
Yes, I asked myself, and other people have asked me too, well, does that still go on? And while it doesn't go on in exactly the same way, technology would be one reason, and the playing field has changed. Nobody's too worried about the Communist Party of Canada anymore, and there have been other things that have happened since September 2011. But what I did notice was that, and this is based on research, really good research that other people have done mostly. But for example, I would say that the communists of yesteryear have, as objects of surveillance, have been replaced by land defenders and environmentalists, particularly related to pipeline construction and carbon projects. And an example would be when the National Energy Board was having hearings about the building of one of the pipelines. The RCMP, CSIS, and some other government organizations, border services, for example, called in the Enbridge and other people who would be involved in the pipeline hearings. So this isn't cutting right away through the bush or something. It's the hearings ahead of time. And they took them into their confidence, and they gave them security clearance, and they basically compared notes and strategy about how to deal with the hearings against the environmentalists and the land defenders. So that's the kind of thing that was going on, at least until 2014. The documents I saw, but more recently, of course, there's a case right now where the Amnesty International is talking about the kind of surveillance which has been taken on various Indigenous groups in BC, and saying that it's completely wrong and shouldn't be done. So I would say communists have been replaced by land defenders and environmentalists in shorthand.
To go back to the National Farmers Union, my grandpa and great uncle helped organize the very first branch of the Farmers Union of Canada, and they called it the Kelvington Ituna Local. Lou Magnamy was the name of my grandpa. They were having a meeting at his farm, and they saw the RCMP coming, and my Aunt Kate quickly gathered the pamphlets, put them in her purse, and the RCMP didn't look in the lady's purse.
Thank you, Mildred.
I think that might be a good place to end here. We're almost out of time. That was a great final note.
Well, I want to thank all of you for coming out. It's always really fun to do these things and compare notes and get good questions and comments. And Dawn and Denise, I want to thank you very much for making this more real than I could make it just talking about it myself, because these were people who were in the trenches and who were persons of interest to the RCMP, shall we say. So thank you very much for participating. Be happy to chat and sign books if anyone likes, but thanks again for coming.
No,